The Wagon to Serenity Cottage. Written and read by the author, Kara Jones. Chapter 1: The Evening Ritual. The Colorado air carried a quiet chill as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with golden and violet hues. Maggie stood at the kitchen corner, carefully pouring steaming peppermint tea into her favorite ceramic mug, a gift from her grandmother. Outside, frost was already settling on the grass, and the stars began to peek through the velvety dusk. This was her favorite time of day, a sacred pause before the world grew completely still. Max, her Persian cat, lounged by the fire, his tail flickering lazily as he watched her every move. He always seemed to sense when it was time to go, leaping into action the moment Maggie reached for her wool scarf. Maggie smiled at his enthusiasm, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders and slipping her gloves on. In the corner, the little red wagon sat waiting, its well-worn handle a testament to years of nightly adventures. As she opened the back door, a soft rush of cold air greeted her, biting her cheeks and making her breath visible. Maggie placed her tea in the wagon, and Max jumped in without hesitation, curling up on the small blanket she had placed for him. The wagon creaked softly as she began to pull it along the familiar path, the crunch of her boots on frost-covered grass, blending with the faint rustle of trees in the distance. The lantern she carried swayed gently with her steps, casting a golden glow on the winding path ahead. Maggie's heart felt lighter with each step away from the house, as if she were shedding the weight of the day. Here, under the endless sky, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the rhythm of her own movement, she felt truly free. Chapter 2: A Walk Through the Pines. The path to Serenity Cottage was Maggie's favorite part of the journey. Tall pine trees lined either side, their snow-dusted branches arching overhead like the vaulted ceiling of an ancient cathedral. The scent of pine needles mixed with crisp winter air, a fragrance that reminded Maggie of her childhood adventures on the very same land. Max peeked out from the wagon, his ears twitching as he listened to the soft sounds of the forest. A gentle breeze carried the distant hoot of an owl, and Maggie smiled, remembering how her grandmother used to tell her stories about the wise old owls that watched over wanderers in the woods. "You're watching over me tonight, aren't you?" she whispered, glancing up at the treetops. The path twisted and turned, revealing glimpses of the moonlight reflecting off patches of snow. Maggie's lantern cast playful shadows that danced on the trunks of the trees, and she let her mind wander with them. This nightly walk wasn't just a physical journey. It was a time for her to reflect, to dream, and to pray. Tonight her thoughts returned to the dreams God had placed in her heart, dreams that felt so close yet so distant. As the cottage came into view, a wave of peace washed over her. Nestled among the trees, its wooden walls seemed to glow with warmth, as if the tiny house itself was welcoming her back. Maggie paused for a moment, taking in the sight before continuing on, her steps lighter than when she had started. Chapter 3: Serenity Cottage. The wooden steps of the cottage creaked under Maggie's boots as she climbed up, lantern in hand. The door, adorned with a wreath of dried lavender and rosemary, swung open with a gentle push. Inside, the room was small but inviting, with a single oil lamp flickering on a round wooden table. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of pine from the logs stacked neatly in the corner. Maggie placed the lantern on the table and set her tea mug beside it. Max hopped out of the wagon, stretching luxuriously before curling up in his favorite spot on the plush armchair. Maggie lit a few candles, their soft glow adding to the warm, tranquil atmosphere. Every corner of the tiny house was filled with treasures, shelves lined with books, a quilt draped over the armchair, and a wooden box of letters that held memories of those she loved. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books, pausing at one she hadn't opened in years. Pulling it down, she flipped through its pages, smiling at the pressed flowers and handwritten notes tucked inside. This was her sanctuary, a place where time slowed down, a time for her to spend with God, and the noise of the world seemed to fade into nothingness. As she settled into the armchair, tea in hand, Maggie felt a familiar tug at her heart. Tonight, she wasn't just here to unwind. She was here to confront the feelings that had been stirring within her. Fear of failure, though intangible, had lingered like a shadow. But in this space, surrounded by reminders of love and faith, she felt ready to face it. Chapter 4, Letters from the Past. The wooden box of letters sat on the desk, tied neatly with ribbons of various colors. Maggie reached for the blue one, her grandmother's favorite color, and untied the ribbon with care. Inside were letters that had been written decades ago, each one a piece of wisdom and encouragement passed down from her grandmother. She unfolded the first letter, the paper soft and worn from years of being handled. Her grandmother's handwriting was elegant and steady, the words filled with grace and love. "Dear Maggie," it began, "never forget that courage isn't about having no fear. It's about trusting God enough to take the next step anyway." Maggie smiled through a tear, feeling her grandmother's presence as if she were sitting right beside her. Each letter she read seemed to spark directly to her current struggles. They were reminders of the strength she carried within her, strength that had been nurtured by her faith and the unwavering support of those who loved her. The fears that had loomed so large just hours ago now seemed a little smaller, a little less intimidating. As Maggie placed the letters back into the box, she felt a sense of clarity begin to form. The tiny house wasn't just a retreat, it was a place of rediscovery. Here, she could reconnect with the truths that often got lost in the busyness of life. And tonight, those truths whispered to her heart, encouraging her to move forward with faith. Chapter 5, Tea and Reflection. With the letters tucked safely back into the box, Maggie returned to her chair, her steaming mug of peppermint tea waiting on the small side table. She cradled the mug in her hands, savoring its warmth as she gazed out the window. Snowflakes had begun to fall, tiny stars twirling in the faint light of the lantern she'd left outside. The world looked peaceful, as if it too had settled into a quiet reflection. Maggie took a sip of her tea, letting the herbal aroma and taste calm her senses. This nightly ritual wasn't just about unwinding. It was a way to center herself, to bring her thoughts into focus. Her mind wandered back to the verse her grandmother had written in one of the letters. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Maggie repeated the words softly, almost like a prayer. The verse reminded her that she didn't need to have everything figured out tonight or even tomorrow. Trust didn't demand a detailed plan. It simply asked for a willing heart, the courage to say yes. Looking around the cottage, Maggie felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This place, her tiny sanctuary, was a gift, one that reminded her of how far she had come. Once she had neglected moments like this, allowing the busyness of life to steal her peace. But now she made time for herself, knowing it was vital for her well-being. And in these moments of quiet, she found strength she didn't know she had. Chapter 6, The Weight of Fear. As the tea grew cooler in her hands, Maggie's thoughts turned to the weight she had been carrying. It was a fear she couldn't quite define, yet it had woven itself into her dreams and held her back from stepping into what she felt called to do. She leaned her head against the back of the chair, her eyes closing as she tried to name the source of her hesitation. Is it failure I'm afraid of? She whispered, the words barely audible over the crackling of the small fireplace. Max stirred, opening one eye, as if to reassure her she wasn't alone in her musings. Maggie chuckled softly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. You're a good listener, she said. Deep down, Maggie knew what God had placed in her heart. She had felt it stirring for years, a calling to create, to share, to use her voice, to sing, and to lead others toward their own journeys of faith and purpose. But with that calling came responsibility, and with responsibility came fear. What if she wasn't enough? What if she misunderstood the path? What if she misunderstood what God showed her and told her? Opening her eyes, she stared into the flames. Fear had a way of disguising itself as logic, she realized. It whispered doubts that seemed reasonable but were rooted in lies. The truth was that God had already equipped her with what she needed, just as her grandmother had written in one of her letters. God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. Maggie repeated the phrase aloud, letting its meaning settle into her spirit. Chapter 7, A Sacred Stillness. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced along the wooden walls of the cottage. Maggie sat quietly, her tea now forgotten on the table. Outside, the snow had blanketed the ground in a soft, pristine white, and the moonlight reflected off it like a mirror. It was as if the entire world had paused, holding its breath in reverence for the moment. Maggie stood and wrapped herself in her shawl, stepping to the window to watch the snow fall. The sight reminded her of how seasons came and went, each one bringing its own lessons. Winter, with its quiet stillness, always spoke to her of rest and renewal. It was time to slow down, to reflect and prepare for what was ahead. Her thoughts turned once more to the dreams in her heart. They weren't new. They had been there for as long as she could remember. But now, in this stillness, they felt clearer, more certain. Maggie pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window, as if reaching out to the vast expanse of possibility that lay beyond. I don't need all the answers, she said softly. I just need to trust in God and take the first step. Max meowed from the chair, as if in agreement, and Maggie smiled. She knew she wasn't alone in this journey. God had been with her every step of the way, gently nudging her forward, even when she felt stuck. Chapter 8: The Journey Home. The clock chimed softly, signaling that it was time to head back. Maggie took one last look around the tiny house, her heart full of gratitude for the peace it had given her tonight. She blew out the candles, placed the letters back in their box, and tucked the quilt neatly over the armchair for Max to nestle into again on their next visit. Pulling her shawl tightly around her, Maggie stepped out into the snow, the lantern in one hand and the wagon handle in the other. Max leapt gracefully into the wagon, curling up on the blanket, as if knowing the routine by heart. The path home seemed even more refreshing under the fresh snow, the lantern light casting a glow that sparkled on the ground. Maggie walked slowly, savoring the stillness of the night. Her breath rose in little puffs, and the crunch of the snow underfoot was the only sound, aside from the occasional rustle of the trees. The walk home felt different tonight, lighter, freer, as if the fear that had weighed on her earlier had begun to lift. As she reached the back door of her house, Maggie paused and turned to look at the tiny house in the distance. Its silhouette was barely visible, but she knew it was there, waiting for her. It wasn't just a place, it was a reminder, a space to reconnect with God, with her dreams, and with herself. Opening the door, she stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloping her like an embrace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had found peace. And with that peace came the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The end.